The Arizona Territory, 1875. A stagecoach rattles through the arid landscape, dust clouds billowing behind it as the setting sun casts long shadows across the rocky formations and cacti. Inside the stagecoach, Elizabeth Montgomery, a refined young woman with worn but once elegant clothes, gazes out at the passing wilderness. Her delicate fingers clutch a locket containing her father's portrait as a tear slides down her cheek. Sharing the cramped space are a portly merchant and his wife, who eye Elizabeth with suspicion. A young woman traveling alone to Redemption Creek, the merchant's wife whispers to her husband, must be one of those women of questionable reputation. Elizabeth pretends not to hear, but the pain is evident in her expression. As dusk settles, the stagecoach rolls into Redemption Creek, a typical frontier town with rough men gathered outside the saloon, horses tied to hitching posts, and supply stores with merchandise displayed in dusty windows. Redemption Creek, end of the line. The coachman calls out. Elizabeth descends from the stagecoach carrying a small valise, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. At the sheriff's office, Sheriff Wilson, a weathered man with tired eyes, listens attentively as Elizabeth explains her situation. Sheriff, I've come to find my uncle, Charles Montgomery. I received his telegram after my father's passing in Boston. She hands him the telegram, which he reads with growing concern. Miss Montgomery, I regret to inform you that your uncle accumulated considerable debts before. Well, he was found dead 3 days ago. Apparently drank too much and fell into the creek. Elizabeth pales at the news. There's another matter, the sheriff continues uncomfortably. Your uncle used you as collateral for a loan. What do you mean, used me? Elizabeth asks, her voice trembling. He signed documents stating you would work to pay off his debts. Legally, these documents ... That's absurd. I never agreed to any such arrangement. Elizabeth protests, shock evident in her voice. Unfortunately, the documents bear what appears to be your signature. Judge Thompson has already ordered a labor auction tomorrow to settle the debts. Elizabeth stares at him, horrified by this turn of events. That night, in a simple hotel room, Elizabeth sits on the bed crying. She takes a small prayer book and a photograph of her parents from her pocket. Father, how could this happen? What am I to do now? She whispers into the darkness. The next morning, a small stage has been erected in the town square. A crowd of men, ranchers, miners, and townsfolk gather as the auctioneer stands beside Sheriff Wilson and Judge Thompson. A severe-looking man with a stern demeanor. Elizabeth is brought to the stage by the sheriff's deputy, struggling to maintain her composure. As determined by the territorial court, Judge Thompson announces, this woman will be auctioned for 3 years of labor to settle the debts left by Charles Montgomery. The starting bid is $100. Murmurs ripple through the crowd as Elizabeth keeps her head high, though her lower lip trembles. In the crowd, Silas Blackwood, a wealthy rancher with an intimidating presence, watches Elizabeth with malicious interest. 3 armed henchmen flank him. We have a healthy young woman from Boston, educated, can read and write, the auctioneer calls out. Could work as a governess, teacher, or domestic help. Who'll give $100? I'll give 100, calls a rancher. 120, a miner counters. $200, Blackwood states firmly. The crowd parts slightly, making space for Blackwood. Many look at him with fear. $200 offered by Mr. Blackwood. Anyone offer more? 210. A shopkeeper ventures. $300, Blackwood declares with authority. The shopkeeper retreats, intimidated. $300 once. At the back of the crowd, a tall, silent man observes the proceedings. Nathaniel Hayes stands apart, a scar across his face and intensity in his eyes. He wears weathered cowboy clothes with a revolver at his hip. $300 twice. $500, Nathaniel says, his voice hoarse as if rarely. Used. Everyone turns in surprise. Silas Blackwood glares at Nathaniel. 600, Blackwood counters. 800, Nathaniel responds without hesitation. Blackwood hesitates, fury building in his expression. $1,000, and I advise you to stop here, Hayes. Nathaniel shows no fear. He removes a leather pouch from his pocket and tosses it onto the stage. 1,500. The crowd buzzes with excitement as Elizabeth watches the bidding. Duel with mounting apprehension. $1,500 once. Twice. Sold to Nathaniel Hayes. The auctioneer declares nervously. Silas Blackwood spits on the ground and makes a threatening gesture toward Nathaniel before stalking away with his men. Elizabeth is led off the stage to where Nathaniel waits. He says nothing, merely gestures for her to follow him. Sir, I appreciate you saving me from that man, but I need to know your intentions, Elizabeth says nervously. Nathaniel doesn't respond verbally. Instead, he takes out a small notepad, writes something, and hands it to her. Elizabeth reads the note. Need someone to keep house. Ranch 3 miles from town. You'll have your own room. Safety. You don single quotes T. Speak? Elizabeth asks uncertainly. Nathaniel shakes his head no. He writes another note. Not since the war. Elizabeth looks at the town, at the sheriff walking away, and then back at Nathaniel. It seems I don't have many options. As Nathaniel drives a simple wagon with Elizabeth beside him along the road to his ranch, she observes the barren landscape, trying to hide her fear. In the distance, Silas Blackwood and his men watch them from atop a hill. Want us to take her from him now, boss? One of Blackwood's henchmen asks. No. Hayes was one of the best shooters in the war. We need to be smarter. Nobody takes what's mine. And that woman was meant to be mine. Nathaniel's ranch comes into view, a modest property with a wooden main house, a small barn, and a corral with a few horses and cattle. Everything is simple, but well-maintained. Elizabeth descends from the wagon, surveying her new home with trepidation. An elderly Apache woman emerges from the house, greeting Nathaniel with a nod. I see you brought the girl the whole town has been talking about, she says in Apache. Nathaniel nods affirmatively. I am Nakia, the woman says to Elizabeth in accented English. I have cared for this stubborn man since he returned from the war. Come, I will show you your room. Elizabeth looks surprised at Nathaniel, who merely gestures for her to follow Nakia. Inside, Nakia leads Elizabeth to a simple but clean room with a straw mattress bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the mountains. He prepared this room yesterday. Knew you would come, Nakia explains. How did he know about me? Elizabeth asks, confused. Nathaniel goes to town once a week. Heard about Charles Montgomery's niece being auctioned. He understands what it is to be sold. Elizabeth looks at the older woman with curiosity. Rest. Now, tomorrow begins new life, Nakia says before leaving Elizabeth alone. Elizabeth sits on the bed, exhausted and confused, but somewhat relieved. That evening, Elizabeth comes downstairs for dinner. The table is set for 3 people. Nathaniel sits reading an old newspaper, but stands when he sees her. Thank you for the room, Mr. Hayes. It's comfortable, Elizabeth offers. Nathaniel nods and writes on his pad. Call me Nathaniel. Nakia brings in a pot of stew. Sit, girl. You need to eat to regain your strength. The 3 sit down. Elizabeth notices when Nathaniel briefly bows his head before eating, a silent prayer. I would like to know what my duties here will be, Elizabeth asks timidly. Nathaniel writes. Help Nakia with the house. Teach me to read better. Nakia is getting old. Not too old to give this hard head a smack. Nakia laughs, a slight smile appears on Nathaniel's face, surprising Elizabeth. You ... Don't read well? Elizabeth inquires. Nathaniel writes, no basics. Want to improve? I can teach you. I was my father's assistant. He was a teacher in Boston. Nathaniel nods, satisfied. Later that night, Elizabeth sits alone on the porch, looking at the stars. Nathaniel comes out and sits in a chair nearby, respecting. Her space dot, he writes something and hands it to her. Elizabeth reads, you are safe here. Blackwood is dangerous. Don't go to town alone. Why did he want me so badly? Elizabeth asks. Nathaniel writes at length and passes her the note. Elizabeth reads, Blackwood collects things others desire, destroys what he cannot possess, controls. The valley, through fear, has had 3 previous wives, none living. Elizabeth pales at this information. And you're not afraid of him? Nathaniel gazes thoughtfully at the horizon before writing, have seen worse things than Blackwood in the war. The two sit in silence, watching the stars spread across the vast western sky. Chapter 2. Secrets Arrivi Elix pass as Elizabeth settles into life at the ranch. Each morning, she rises early to help Nakia with breakfast before the older woman teaches her the daily tasks, churning butter, preserving vegetables from the small garden, mending clothes. In the afternoons, Elizabeth sits with Nathaniel on the porch, teaching him to read from one of the few books in the house, a collection of Shakespeare's works. His progress is remarkable. He clearly had some education before the war. Your handwriting is excellent for someone who claims to read poorly. Elizabeth observes one day. Nathaniel hesitates, then writes, could read well once, after the war. Words jumble sometimes. Mind plays tricks. The war affected many men that way, Elizabeth says gently. My father treated veterans in Boston. He called it soldier's heart. Nathaniel nods, a flash of pain crossing his face. One morning, Elizabeth is hanging laundry when she sees riders approaching, Silas Blackwood and 2 of his men. She hurries inside to find Nathaniel. Mr. Blackwood is coming, she warns, trying to keep her voice steady. Nathaniel's expression hardens. He gestures for her to stay inside and steps onto the porch, his hand resting near his holstered revolver. From inside, Elizabeth watches through the window as Blackwood reins his horse to a stop. Hayes, Blackwood calls out, just making neighborly rounds. Thought I'd check on your ... investment. His eyes search the house, looking for Elizabeth. Nathaniel stands silently, his stance clearly communicating that Blackwood isn't welcome. Still, not talking, I see, Blackwood smirks. One day you'll have to use that voice of yours, Hayes. Maybe when you're begging for mercy. Blackwood tosses something onto the porch, a folded newspaper. Thought you might be interested. Seems the Valley's water rights are coming up for review. Small ranchers like yourself might find themselves ... parched. After Blackwood and his men ride away, Elizabeth joins Nathaniel on the porch. He unfolds the newspaper, revealing a notice about water rights being consolidated for efficiency and progress. He's trying to take control of the water? Elizabeth asks. Nathaniel nods grimly. That night at dinner, Elizabeth gathers her courage. May I ask how you lost your voice? Nakia and Nathaniel exchange glances. Not lost, Nakia explains. Choosing not to use. Since Antietam. Elizabeth's eyes widen. You fought at Antietam? Nathaniel nods, his expression darkening. He writes, was scout, saw massacre coming, tried to warn. Commander ignored me. Watched 600 men die in 15 minutes. That's terrible, Elizabeth whispers. After battle, he stopped talking, Nakia continues. Came west to forget. And Mr. Blackwood? How does he know you? Nathaniel writes, same regiment. He was officer who ignored warning. The next day, a neighbor, Thomas Jensen, rides to the ranch in a panic. Hayes, Blackwood's men are damming the creek upstream. My fields are already drying up. Nathaniel mounts his horse, gesturing for Jensen to lead the way. Elizabeth, concerned, watches them ride off. Hours later, Nathaniel returns with a bloodied lip and bruised knuckles. Elizabeth rushes to help him inside. What happened? She asks as she cleans his wounds. He writes, Blackwood's men had guns. We had shovels. They fired warning shots. Dam still stands. This isn't right, Elizabeth protests. There must be a law against this, Nathaniel writes. Law is 3 days' ride away. Judge Thompson works for Blackwood. That night, unable to sleep, Elizabeth finds Nathaniel's war trunk in the barn. Inside are medals, including a sharpshooter badge, letters, and a journal. Though she knows she shouldn't, she begins to read. The journal reveals Nathaniel's history. A brilliant marksman who served as a scout, respected by his men, but at odds with commanding officers who refused to listen to frontline intelligence. The final entry, dated September 17, 1862, Antietam, is stained with blood. I warned them. The enemy was waiting in the cornfield. Captain Blackwood called me a coward, ordered the charge anyway. I watched my friends die in rows, cut down. Like wheat, their screams still echo. What use are words when no one listens? I will carry this silence as my penance. Elizabeth weeps as she reads, finally understanding Nathaniel's burden. The next morning, Elizabeth rides into town despite Nathaniel's warnings. She visits other small ranchers, explaining Blackwood's water scheme. Many are fearful, but some agree to meet at Nathaniel's ranch to discuss resistance. As she leaves the general store, Blackwood confronts her. Miss Montgomery, he says, removing his hat with false courtesy. I've been hoping to make your acquaintance properly. Mr. Blackwood, Elizabeth acknowledges coolly. A refined woman like yourself must find ranch life ... primitive. Hayes can barely string together a sentence. Hardly suitable company for a Boston lady. I find honest work and honest people refreshing after Boston society's pretensions, Elizabeth responds. Blackwood steps closer. You know, I could give you comforts. Hayes never could. A proper house, servants. Like your previous wives enjoyed, before their untimely ends? Elizabeth challenges. Blackwood's smile vanishes. You should be careful about repeating gossip, Miss Montgomery. It can be dangerous. So is threatening people and stealing their water, Elizabeth retorts before walking briskly to her wagon. That evening, several ranchers gather at Nathaniel's home. They're skeptical about confronting Blackwood until Elizabeth reveals documents she found at the town hall, showing the water rights actually belong collectively to all landowners. Blackwood is counting on us being too afraid to fight back, Elizabeth tells them. Together, we have a legal claim. The ranchers agree to petition the territorial governor, but as they leave, gunshots ring out from the ridge overlooking the ranch. Everyone takes cover as bullets strike the house. When the shooting stops, Nathaniel checks on everyone. No one is hurt, but the message is clear. Later, while Elizabeth tends to a frightened horse in the barn, Nathaniel approaches with a lantern. He writes, Too dangerous. You should leave when stage comes through next week. And go where? Elizabeth asks. Back east, where I have nothing? To another town where women have few options? I'm staying. Nathaniel shakes his head and writes, Blackwood will burn this place down to get what he wants. Then we'll rebuild, Elizabeth insists. I've lost everything once already. I won't run. Nathaniel stares at her, a new emotion flickering in his eyes. He reaches out, hesitantly touching her cheek with calloused fingers. Elizabeth steps closer. I read your journal, she confesses. I know about Antietam. About why you don't speak. Nathaniel pulls back, anger and betrayal crossing his face. You've been carrying this burden alone for too long, Elizabeth continues. Your silence won't. Bring those men back, but your voice might save the people here. Nathaniel turns away, his shoulders rigid with tension. I lost everything too, Elizabeth says softly. My father died owing money to men who saw an opportunity in my desperation. My uncle promised help, then betrayed me. But I refused to let that define me. Nathaniel remains with his back to her, but she can see the struggle in his posture. We all have ghosts, Nathaniel. The question is whether we let them haunt us or put them to rest. She leaves him standing in the barn, the lantern light casting long shadows around him. Chapter 3. Fire and Aridine Pitingwa the morning after the shooting. Nathaniel finds the water to the ranch has stopped completely. He rides out with several neighboring ranchers to discover Blackwood's men have built a larger dam, diverting the entire creek to Blackwood's property. When they return to the ranch, they find Elizabeth organizing women from neighboring farms. They've brought food, supplies, and determined expressions. We've started a letter-writing campaign, Elizabeth explains. Every woman here is writing to relatives back east, to newspapers, to the governor. Blackwood might control this valley, but he doesn't control public opinion. Nathaniel looks impressed, but worried. Over the next weeks, the situation worsens. Without water, crops begin to die. Cattle grow thin. Blackwood offers to buy out struggling ranchers at a fraction of their land's worth. Elizabeth establishes a communal garden near a small spring that's still flowing, organizing families to share the meager water and food. Her leadership surprises and inspires the community. One evening, as Elizabeth and Nathaniel sit on the porch, she notices an orange glow on the horizon. Fire, she exclaims. They rush to saddle horses and ride toward the flames, finding the Jensen family's ranch engulfed. Thomas Jensen lies injured while his wife and children battle the blaze. Blackwood's men, Jensen gasps, said it was my last warning for organizing with you folks. The neighboring ranchers form a bucket brigade from the spring, fighting through the night to save what they can. By dawn, the house is gone, but the barn and livestock are spared. As they return exhausted to Nathaniel's ranch, they find Nakia waiting with urgent news. Riders coming, she warns. Many men. They watch as at least a dozen armed men approach, led by Blackwood. Time for talking is over, Hayes, Blackwood calls out. You've got until sundown tomorrow to clear out. Take your woman if you want, or leave her. I'll be taking this land either way. Nathaniel steps forward, his hand near his gun. Don't be stupid, Blackwood warns. Even you can't outdraw 12 men. After Blackwood and his men leave, the ranchers look to Nathaniel, uncertain. What are we going to do? Jensen asks. We can't fight that many gunmen. Nathaniel looks at Elizabeth, then writes something and shows it to the group. Need to get. Word to Marshal in Tucson. Federal law supersedes territorial judge. That's 3 days hard riding, one rancher protests. Blackwood's deadline is tomorrow. Elizabeth steps forward. We need to buy time. That night, Elizabeth prepares to ride to a neighboring town with the water rights documents, planning to telegraph the federal marshal. Despite Nathaniel's objections, she insists she's the least likely to be stopped. Blackwood will be watching the men, she argues. A woman alone at night might slip through. As she prepares to leave, Nathaniel grabs her arm. Their eyes meet in the lantern light. I'll be careful, she promises. Nathaniel's struggle is visible on his face. Then, in a voice rough from disuse, he whispers, Come back. Elizabeth's eyes widen at hearing his voice for the first time. I will, she promises, deeply moved. She rides out under cover of darkness, while Nathaniel and the other ranchers prepare defenses, expecting Blackwood's men to attack regardless of the deadline. Elizabeth is halfway to the next town when she's ambushed by two of Blackwood's men. They drag her back toward Blackwood's ranch, but she manages to hide the documents in her boot before they search her dot at dawn. Blackwood parades Elizabeth in front of Nathaniel's ranch, where the ranchers have barricaded themselves. "Hayes!" Blackwood shouts, "I've got something of yours. Come out alone, or she dies first." Inside the ranch house, the men look to Nathaniel. "You can't go out there," Jensen insists. "He'll kill you both." For the first time in front of others, Nathaniel speaks, his voice still raspy from years of silence. "Get ready. When shooting starts, fire at the men on the left flank. I'll handle Blackwood." The men stare in shock. Hearing his voice for the first time, Nathaniel walks onto the porch, hands raised. "Let her go, Silas," he calls out, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is between you and me. Has been since Antietam." Blackwood looks, momentarily surprised to hear Nathaniel speak. "Well, well." The mute finds his voice for his woman. "How touching. You sacrificed your own men for advancement," Nathaniel continues. "You'll sacrifice these ranchers for the same reason. It ends today." "Big words from a man with a gun at his woman's head," Blackwood sneers. "Throw out your weapon and surrender the deed to your land." Nathaniel slowly removes his gun belt, dropping it on the porch. "Now the deed," Blackwood demands. "Inside," Nathaniel replies. "Let Elizabeth go, and I'll get it." "Send someone else for it," Blackwood counters. Nathaniel looks at Elizabeth, whose eyes communicate something. He nods almost imperceptibly. "Jensen," Nathaniel calls. "Bring the deed from my desk drawer." As Jensen goes inside, Elizabeth suddenly collapses, appearing to faint. The distraction momentarily pulls the gunman's attention from her. In that split second, Nathaniel drops to a crouch, pulls a hidden derringer from his boot, and fires. Shot hits Blackwood's lieutenant, holding Elizabeth. Simultaneously, Elizabeth rolls away as gunfire erupts from the ranch house. Nathaniel sprints forward, tackling Elizabeth to shield her with his body as they crawl to cover behind a water trough. "Are you hurt?" he asks urgently. "No," she gasps. "I hid the water rights documents in my boot." In the ensuing gun battle, several of Blackwood's men fall. Blackwood himself retreats behind a shed, pinned down by fire from the house. "It's over." "Silas," Nathaniel shouts, "your men are deserting you, just like at Antietam. It's never over." Blackwood screams, firing wildly. "This valley is mine." Suddenly, rifle shots come from the ridge above, but they're targeting Blackwood's remaining men. Nakia has positioned herself with Nathaniel's hunting rifle and is providing covering fire. With his men fleeing or wounded, Blackwood makes a desperate charge toward Nathaniel and Elizabeth. Firing his revolver, Nathaniel pushes Elizabeth behind him and draws his backup revolver from his waistband. The two men fire simultaneously. Blackwood stumbles, hit in the shoulder, but keeps coming. Nathaniel's second shot takes him down. As the gun smoke clears, Nathaniel approaches Blackwood, who lies gasping in the dust. "You should have died at Antietam with the rest," Blackwood spits. "With your Indian-loving father." Elizabeth comes to stand beside Nathaniel as understanding dawns on his face. "You knew my father was the scout who married into the Apache," Nathaniel says. "That's why you ignored my warning. You wanted the Hayes bloodline to end." "Half-breeds have no place giving orders to white officers," Blackwood gasps, blood staining his shirt. "And now you'll hang for murder, attempted murder, and land theft," Elizabeth says, pulling the water rights documents from her boot. "These prove everything." Blackwood laughs bitterly. "No one hangs men like me out here." But as he speaks, the sound of approaching horses draws their attention. A group of riders appears, the territorial marshal with a posse, summoned by one of the rancher's wives who had slipped away during the night. "Looks like someone does," Nathaniel replies. 4. The final Sione Faronte ATO, and after Blackwoods, a rest, an uneasy peace settles over the valley. The water rights are restored to all ranchers, and the dam is dismantled. Elizabeth and Nathaniel begin rebuilding what was damaged in the gunfight. Their relationship has changed. Nathaniel speaks now, though still sparingly. Each word seems carefully chosen, meaningful. One evening, as they sit on the porch watching the sunset, Elizabeth asks, "Will you tell me about your father, the Apache scout?" Nathaniel is quiet for a moment. He was a cavalry scout who fell in love with an Apache woman during a peace negotiation. They married against everyone's wishes. He taught me to track, to shoot, to respect both sides of my heritage. Is that why you bought me at the auction? Because you knew what it was like to be judged for something beyond your control. Nathaniel nods. When I heard Charles Montgomery's niece was being sold, I remembered my mother's stories of being treated as property. I couldn't let that happen to another person. Thank you, Elizabeth says softly, her hand finding his. Their moment is interrupted by a rider approaching, the marshal's deputy. "Hayes, Miss Montgomery, Blackwood's escaped. Killed 2 guards. Word is he's heading this way, with what's left of his gang." Nathaniel rises immediately. "How many men? 5 or 6? Mean ones?" Marshals gathering a posse, but they're half a day behind. After the deputy leaves, Nathaniel begins preparing defenses. "You should hide in the root cellar," he tells Elizabeth. "I won't hide while you risk your life," she protests. "I can shoot. My father taught me." Nathaniel looks at her with newfound respect. "Then we defend our home together." They work through the night, positioning furniture as barriers, loading extra rifles, creating defensive positions. Nakia prepares food and medical supplies, her weathered hands steady and sure. "I have lived through many battles," she tells Elizabeth. "Apache women fight beside their men when enemies threaten the home." At dawn, they see dust on the horizon, riders approaching fast. Nathaniel positions himself at the front window, rifle ready. Elizabeth takes the side window, and Nakia guards the back door with a shotgun. "Remember," Nathaniel says, "Blackwood will be desperate. He has nothing to lose now." The riders stop just out of rifle range. Through field glasses, Nathaniel counts 5 men besides Blackwood, all heavily armed. "Hayes," Blackwood shouts, "come out and face me man to man. Or are you hiding behind women's skirts?" Nathaniel doesn't respond. Instead, he signals to Elizabeth to hold her position. "I'm burning this place to the ground, Hayes." "You, the woman. The old Indian, you'll all die today." One of Blackwood's men lights a torch and wraps it around an arrow, a fire arrow meant for the roof. "Wait for my signal," Nathaniel whispers to Elizabeth. The archer takes aim and fires. The burning arrow arcs toward the house, but before it can land, Nathaniel fires. The arrow splinters mid-air, fragments of burning cloth falling harmlessly to the ground. "That's one shot," Nathaniel calls out. "I've got plenty more where that came from." Blackwood's men look nervous, having witnessed Nathaniel's legendary marksmanship. "Rush them," Blackwood orders, but his men hesitate. "You heard what he did in the war," one man says. They called him 3-shot Hayes, never needed more than 3 bullets to take down an enemy. "He's one man." Blackwood rages. "With one woman who shoots like a man," Elizabeth calls out, firing a warning shot that knocks the hat off one of the outlaws. The display of skill further unnerves Blackwood's men. 2 of them suddenly wheel their horses around and gallop away. "Cowards!" Blackwood screams after them. With only 3 men left, Blackwood changes tactics. "Spread out," he orders. "Circle the house." The remaining men separate, trying to approach from different directions. Nathaniel, Elizabeth, and Nakia adjust their positions accordingly. A shootout ensues. with bullets splintering wood and shattering windows. One of Blackwood's men falls, hit by Nakia's shotgun as he tried to enter through the kitchen. Another is wounded by Elizabeth's careful aim when he exposes himself trying to reach the barn. But Blackwood and his last man use the distraction to reach the porch. They kick in the front door, forcing Nathaniel to retreat to the stairs where Elizabeth has positioned herself. "I've dreamed of this moment, Hayes," Blackwood snarls, bleeding from a wound in his side. "You took everything from me." "You destroyed yourself, Silas," Nathaniel replies, "just like at Antietam." Blackwood raises his gun, but Elizabeth fires first, hitting his remaining henchman. As Blackwood turns toward her, Nathaniel lunges, tackling him. The two men crash to the floor, Blackwood's gun skidding away. They grapple violently, years of hatred fueling Blackwood's strength despite his wounds. He manages to pull a knife, slashing Nathaniel across the arm. Elizabeth tries to get a clean shot, but the men are too entangled. She circles them, waiting for an opening. Blackwood pins Nathaniel briefly, raising the knife for a killing blow. "Your father died begging," he hisses. "Just like you will." Something shifts in Nathaniel's eyes, not fear, but clarity. "My father died protecting what he loved," he responds. "As will I." With a surge of strength, Nathaniel reverses their position, forcing Blackwood's knife hand to the floor. The blade turns inward as they struggle. "Elizabeth," Nathaniel calls, straining against Blackwood's strength. "Get out of here." Instead, Elizabeth steps forward and places her revolver against Blackwood's temple. "It's over," she says firmly. "Let him go or die right here." Blackwood freezes, then laughs bitterly. "You won't shoot a man in cold blood. Not a proper Boston lady." "I'm not a Boston lady anymore," Elizabeth replies steadily. "I'm a woman of the frontier, protecting my home." The sound of approaching riders interrupts the standoff. The marshal's posse has finally arrived. Knowing he's defeated, Blackwood makes one last desperate move, wrenching away from Nathaniel and lunging toward Elizabeth. A single shot rings. Out. Blackwood falls, a look of surprise on his face. Nathaniel rises slowly, his smoking gun in hand. "No one threatens my family," he says quietly. The marshal and his men burst through the door moments later, finding Blackwood dead and Nathaniel standing protectively in front of Elizabeth after giving their statements. The marshal assures them that with multiple witnesses to Blackwood's escape and threats, the shooting will be ruled self-defense. As the posse departs with the bodies, Nathaniel, Elizabeth, and Nakia survey the damaged ranch house. "It will take weeks to repair everything," Elizabeth sighs. Nathaniel puts his arm around her shoulders. "We have time." "And help." He gestures to the horizon, where wagons are approaching, the neighboring ranchers coming to assist. "You know," Elizabeth says, leaning against him, "when I was sold at that auction, I thought it was the worst day of my life. Now I think it might have been the best." Nathaniel smiles, the expression transforming his scarred face. "I bought a housekeeper and found a partner." "Partner," Elizabeth repeats, testing the word. "I like that." 3 months later, the ranch house has been rebuilt, larger than before, with an additional room that Elizabeth has converted into a classroom. Children from neighboring ranches gather there each afternoon for lessons. The water flows freely, again nourishing the land. Nathaniel speaks more often now, his voice growing stronger with use. At community gatherings, people listen when he talks, respecting both his words and his silence when he chooses it. One evening, as they sit on their new porch watching the sunset, Nathaniel takes Elizabeth's hand. "I have something to ask you," he says, his voice no longer raspy but deep and sure. "What is it?" Elizabeth asks, though her smile suggests she already knows. "Will you be my partner in name as well as deed? Will you marry me, Elizabeth?" She turns to him, eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. "I was sold once," she says, "but now I give myself freely. Yes, Nathaniel Hayes, I will marry you." As they embrace, Nakia watches from the doorway, nodding with satisfaction. In the distance, the sun sets over Redemption Creek, a town finally living up to its name.